When you consider that Acts, the book of Acts, was written about 2,000 years ago, near now, there is something unmistakably modern about the reading from Acts today. Because when it says in there, there's that line that says, the circumcised believers who had come with Peter were astounded that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on the Gentiles. It makes those people sound like everybody today who is surprised to discover that someone that they looked at and they could see was different, somebody they maybe distrusted or even despised, or even somebody that they thought maybe wasn't as good as they are. Turns out they're just like them. Maybe modern isn't the right word. Maybe it's just one of those things that's timeless. Because people seem to like to do that. We like to look at people who are different and say, well, if they're different, that must mean they're not as good. So I think today's reading from Acts has a great message for us in this time and this place in our history, because we seem to be more focused than ever on division instead of unity. You look at the news, you look at the newspapers, you look on social media, you look basically anywhere, and it seems that we're more concerned about what our differences are than our similarities. So this sudden revelation that we see in Acts that, hey, God cares about those people too. I think that's a good message. And it's a great reminder about God's kingdom and the realities of what it means to live in God's kingdom. So how did we get to that moment in Acts? How did we get to that moment of epiphany and revelation? Like any good Methodist story, it starts with food. Because earlier in Acts, up about verses 9 or 10, Peter is in a town called Joppa. And it's noon, and he's hungry. And he goes up on the roof of the house that he's staying in. He goes up on the roof to pray. He wants to be apart from everyone else. And he goes up there, and he starts to pray, and then he has a vision. Now, when I'm hungry, I have visions of quarter pounders and French fries. Maybe some blueberry pie. Peter's vision is very different from that. Because what he envisions is this great sheet coming down from the heavens, and it's held up by the four corners. And when you hear what's in it, you stop thinking sheet, maybe you start thinking like picnic blanket. Because in this sheet are all kinds of animals. You know, apart from all of the regular animals, the sheep and the cattle and those kinds of things, there are reptiles, there are snakes, there's birds, there's insects. All sorts of things that creeped and crawled, and Peter sees these things in there. And then a voice from heaven says, hey, Peter, dude, if you're hungry, just, kill something and eat it. And Peter, who is a devout Jew, says, no way, I'm not going to do that. I have never eaten anything that's profane or unclean. And most of the stuff in there, that's exactly what it is. Now, what does he mean by that? At the time that this is happening, this is around 49 AD or so. At the time that's happening, for about the last 1,200 years, Jews had lived under some very strict dietary laws. Collectively, they're called kashrut. And I'm not going to get into the weeds about what the different laws are, but they're very specific. And one of the things they say is that as far as meat is concerned, the only thing a devout Jew can eat is meat from an animal that has a cloven hoof and chews a cud. Well, I was going to say or, but there's no or. That's it. Which means you cattle, sheep, goats. I think there's another one in there, but deer. Pretty much the rest of the animal kingdom is ruled out. And if it comes from the sea, it has to have fins and scales. So there's no shrimp and lobster and stuff like that. Everything else, as far as they're concerned, is out of bounds. It is profane. It's not to be eaten. And so in this vision, when that voice tells Peter, just pick a food, any food, and eat it, he would be horrified by that. Peter would look at that and just would be grossed out by the idea of eating something unclean that way. And when he says that, the voice answers him and says, what God has made clean, you, Peter, you cannot call profane. And that whole cycle repeats itself 3 times in his vision. And then the cloth goes back up into the heavens, and Peter is left trying to figure out what he just saw. And still hungry. And Peter is still trying to make sense of this when a couple of messengers arrive from the town of Caesarea, which is not too far from there. And these guys have an invitation for Peter to come up and spend some time with a Roman Centurion up there. His name is Cornelius. And Cornelius, they tell him, is a devout man. He's a believer in God, and he would like to see Peter. And for some reason, Peter agrees. And it may be that at that point already, the vision is starting to work on him. We don't know. But Peter agrees, and the next day, he and these messengers go back up to Joppa. And all the while that they're traveling, Peter is thinking about this thing that he had just seen the day before, this vision. And he's trying to figure it out. Because it seems like God was saying, you know, all those dietary laws I have for you, don't worry about it anymore. You can eat whatever you want. You know, the McRib is back on the menu. Why would that be? Now, one of the things to think about while Peter is traveling to Caesarea is why those laws were put into place in the first place. Some say that it was a health and a sanitation thing, because this was back when, after the Jewish people had left, the Hebrew people had left Egypt, and they were on their way to the Promised Land, and they were out in the middle of nowhere. So some say it was a sanitation thing. Others say that it related to the tension that always existed between the religion of the Jewish people and the other local religions. But many scholars now have come to believe that the main reason for these dietary laws was just to set them apart. It was to have something in their culture that differentiated them from everybody else, something obvious. Something that would be a part of everyday life, so they would be reminded every day when they followed Kashrut, they would be reminded that they are different and apart from the Gentiles. And if you think about that, that makes an awful lot of sense, because at that time, this is back, the laws come from the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, like I said, out in the desert. They were trying to make themselves into a unified people. So maybe that made a lot of sense. And if you think about it in that way, you maybe start to get an inkling of what was happening here. Now, by all rights, Peter shouldn't have ever, agreed to go visit Cornelius in his house. Because, again, as a devout Jew, you don't really want to associate with Gentiles. Certainly don't want to go eat with them. And yet this is exactly what Peter was doing. And I think it's because the vision was already working on. And later on in Acts 10, verse 34, Peter has had this long conversation with Cornelius, and Cornelius has told him that he believes very much in God. The same God that Peter worships. And he's telling them all these things. He's telling them about a vision that he himself had. And Peter suddenly says, the light bulb goes on. And Peter says, I understand now that God shows no partiality. But in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to God. And that is a revelation. And with that realization all of a sudden, popping up in his head, Peter knows that he has to preach the gospel to these people too, even these Gentiles. And he starts to preach, and soon after that, we're told that the Holy Spirit is poured out upon Cornelius and his household. The Holy Spirit comes down, and it comes to these Gentiles for everybody to see and hear, and it shocks his Jewish followers who couldn't believe that Gentiles were being blessed in this way. And it's a beautiful moment when this old soldier and his household learn about Jesus and have the Holy Spirit poured out on them. And you think about it, Cornelius, probably some of his friends were the very people who executed Jesus in Jerusalem. Roman army. It's a turning point. It's a turning point in the early church history because it's a moment when the focus of the church or the movement starts to change from just Jews to all of humanity. It's the moment when they move from being kind of a splinter group of the Jewish religion to being something more. And for that reason alone, it's a worthwhile reading. But I also think there is something else going on here. I think this particular passage today, as I alluded to earlier, has a meaning that speaks to us where we are. It speaks to the way that we as a nation seem to be desperately trying to divide ourselves. It speaks to the way that we seem to look at others and we focus on language or race or gender identity. We focus on all of those silly things, those labels that we've invented to define ourselves, instead of looking at the ways that we are similar. It speaks to the way that we look at others and focus on, wow, you're different from me. Why is that? Instead of looking at them and saying, hey, I can see you're the same in a lot of ways. We fall into the trap of forgetting other people's humanity sometimes. What does Peter say? I understand that God shows no partiality. In other words, forget the barriers. Forget the separations. Forget the things that seem to divide us. Forget race and nationality and identity and gender and all of that, and instead try to see what God sees. God doesn't look at us and just see, oh, there's this gender and there's this nationality and there's, they're conservative, they're liberal, they're this, they're that. He doesn't look at us and see all of that. He looks at us and sees his children. His misguided children sometimes. But he looks at us and sees his children. And we need to look at one another and see brothers and sisters. We need to look at one another and see human hearts that are in need of healing sometimes. And souls that are in need of relationship and reconnection. And if we can connect on that level with one another, and if we can connect on that level with the people around us, if we can preach to those who are hurting, and if we can show them how the gospel that we know can fill the hole in their lives, then we can help them reconnect with God. And if we can do that, if we can show people how they can connect with God, just imagine the changes that could happen in this world. Just imagine the changes that could happen to them, to us.